I'll be talking about the US context exclusively today, but I'm very curious to hear you guys, your reactions to it and how it compares to your experience here, right? The reason I'll be talking about the US context is because the national park idea is born in the United States. It is a US export, properly speaking. Okay? That is now all over the world, right? And has more or less the same format, right? All over the world. In the US, this democratic space, right? What that means is not only can you go, you drive your car in, you pay your 100 rubles or your $20 or whatever, right? And you can enter. But the National Park Service website in the US has a special section where all of the work that's being done on every single park, however small the project, however insignificant the project may seem, it is listed there for every single one of the parks, and you, right, can comment on it. Right? So it's democratic even in that way. So if you want to oppose some kind of construction or the rebuilding of a bridge or devoting funds, because, by the way, where does money come from for keeping these parks? From your taxes, right? That's the other way in which it's democratic. So this idea that we are all equally involved, right, in the maintenance of these places. This is what this looks like right now in the United States. Okay? So here is a quote from a documentary that I've written a great deal about. Do you guys know who Ken Burns is? Does this name mean anything? Fantastic. Okay? In America, everyone knows this name. Why? This is the guy who has made multiple documentaries about America, for Americans, right? So, for example, jazz is one. Baseball is another, right? The Civil War is another. I don't remember the others right now, but there's a bunch of them, and he has won, he wins all of the highest awards. He is considered the documentarian, right? Ken Burns is sort of the documentarian of a certain kind of American fantasy about itself. Okay? He did a 6-part documentary series called The National Parks, America's Best Idea, in which he finally, sort of for the first time, makes available to his audience the history of the national parks. So this is from America's Best Idea. The national parks embody a radical idea as uniquely American as the Declaration of Independence, born in the United States nearly a century after its creation. We are talking about the 1870s, 60s, 70s, to the 1890s. I'll talk about that. It is a truly democratic idea that the magnificent natural wonders of the land should be available not to a privileged few, but to everyone. Okay, so we've got this notion. The parks belong to you. What else? Just you? The parks belong to you guys?
It's protection for exploration, forest exploration, animal exploration.
For whom? For whom?
From
Just us. For the next generation, right? This is also, that's something that's really like beaten into this idea, right? So part one of the idea is it's everyone. It's not the rich. It's everyone, right? Part two of the idea is, as Burns says in the documentary, all that we ask of you is that you keep it safe for your children, right? So it's this, that's the other sort of, that's the second moment. It's yours, right, to keep safe for the future. When the Organic Act, when the US Congress passed the Organic Act of 1916, which was the law that created the National Park Service, okay? This was written into the Organic Act, okay? To conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of generations, right? So you preserve, you conserve, not for yourself, for the future. Okay. So this is important. In the US, the parks were not just the creation of new spaces. They were the creation of a new government, of a new branch of government, of a new arm of the state. Let's put it that way, right? So the National Park Service didn't exist until 1916, right? And now they are state employees, like the post office, the postal service, right? Or the military. Right? That's what National Park Service is. I didn't know this as a child. I was sure they were all just scientists, right? But they are like any other arm of the state, the police, for example. Okay? All right. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the history of this. Do you guys like going to parks? Tell me why. Hands. Please tell me why. What's good about it? What do we like about it? Yes?
Most of parks are natural rich.
Yes.
My English is so bad.
It's
Sorry.
wonderful. They're nature rich, yes.
And that's why in our cities we don't see the nature. We see buildings, we see streets and etc. And that's why it's so enjoy to go to the park, and there will be trees and etc. Natural rich.
Natural, yes, right. So this idea, right, that we get something there that we don't get in our daily lives,
Yeah.
in our urban lives.
We don't see it.
We don't see it. We don't smell it.
Yeah.
We don't hear it, right? What else? Why else do you like to be there? Yes, Alex.
Actually, the most beautiful places are selected for national parks.
So they are really beautiful,
Yes.
really and truly.
If there is some beautiful place, it's likely that it's a national park.
Yeah. Yes, in the back, please.
For me, it's a source of distraction for everyday routine life and the source of inspiration.
It's a break, a distraction, inspiration, right? Yes.
They also have a lot of oxygen, so you breathe easily and you feel healthier.
You feel healthier, your brain works better, so you can come back to SAS and, you know, just do an amazing job in your environmental thinking class, right? Yes.
This is also a place where you can just see where the human was born, like all the natural, how to say, where first.
The idea that there's something original here, that there's something old, right, about you, about me, right, that there is about everyone, right? yeah, I think this is a very interesting, this once we sort of get a little bit deeper and it's not like, hey, I'm on vacation, this is awesome, Instagram, right? Where it's not just that. There's a lot of literature about this that says exactly this, right? When we read conservationist literature, we hear this kind of refrain over and over, right? Jack Turner has a book in which he says something like, go at night into the forest and sit down by yourself, no stuff, and just listen. And then he says, something very old will return. I love this quote. I mean, it's super cheesy, of course, but it's also kind of an interesting, like, what does he mean? What is this something very old? But we have this notion, right, that there is something true here, something that we need, something healthy. Just a few hundred years ago, this was not the case, right? Just a few hundred years ago, the wilderness was a place you did not go. Can you imagine why you would not go to the wilderness?
Because it's dangerous?
Dangerous. Like what? Dangerous like what?
Like unexplored.
Sure. What's going to happen to you? Who knows? Nobody knows. Yeah, there'd be dragons there. Nobody knows, right?
You can get lost.
You can get lost. You can get eaten, right? You can freeze to death. You can die of heat. You can, right? All of these things can happen to you. The wilderness was precisely the place one did not go, right? If the city wanted to punish you, it exiled you to the wilderness or to the mountains or to the forest or something where you would die. That was the point. Right? So it's only in recent times that we've gotten this. Ladies, could I have your attention, please? Thank you. It's only in recent times that we've developed, right, this kind of hunger, this need, this pleasure, right, at going to these places, in going to these places. This starts in 18th century Europe, more or less, right? The rise of the bourgeoisie is also the appearance of gardens, not just for kings, right, but for the bourgeois. So there are private gardens. There is a sense that nature is something to be enjoyed, right? I make my garden, it's beautiful. Many wealthy people had aviaries, which is this wonderful ancient word. It's like a place where you keep birds, right? Aviaries or menageries with small animals, small wild animals that were there to delight you and to delight your guests. Your guests would come for, I don't know, tea and crumpets or something, and then they could enjoy the ferret or your parrot or something else, right? So there was this sense that, but in the 18th century, we see the birth of something like what we call rational land management. And in the course of this rational land management, keep in mind, of course, at the same time, we've got explorers exploring, right? They're exploring over there where there are dragons, right? They're exploring over there, and they're sending reports back that there are these amazing lands, that there are these amazing things that we can't imagine, that they are out there to see. So over in the 18th century, we have a kind of a change in attitude, right, to what we might call nature. So that's already there. But the national park is something completely different from that, okay? Now, who knows what this is? This is Central Park. Where's Central Park? In New York. In New York. Where in New York? Where is it? It's in Manhattan, right? This is Central Park. It's in Manhattan, right? We are right now looking from south, we're looking north. So this is New Jersey. And this over here on the other side is Brooklyn and Queens. This is Central Park. Built in, the project starts in 1857. And it is deliberately planned as a different sort of park than the world had ever seen. Different because it used the natural elements that are there, like certain rocks, the water formations, I don't know all the details, right? But there's this idea that goes into the planning of Central Park that what's there is valuable, that it doesn't need to be manicured, but that there's something there already, that's all the people of the city need. They just need to go there and sort of hang out with the rocks and hang out with the bushes and the trees. So when you go to Central Park, you kind of walk around and you're like, that's it? What's the big deal, right? Because there's kind of, I mean, it's fantastic, but not really. You know, it's fantastic if you're a New Yorker because you just want to kill yourself all the time because the city is so overwhelming, and then you get a break. But there's nothing about it. You're not going to have postcards of Central Park. That's why most of the images of Central Park are aerial, because it's pretty fantastic to look at from the aerial view. But when you're down there, it's just some grass and some bushes, right? It's plain. It's the people's park. It was planned this way deliberately by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. I'm going to show this to you guys here. So you can see, here it is from the other direction. So we're looking north to south now, right? And it's in winter. And this, of course, is the satellite view. Excuse me. Okay. Frederick Law Olmsted, architect of Central Park, architect of a bunch of sort of urban nature initiatives in the United States on the East Coast, in the South. He wrote an enormous amount. And he was involved, bizarrely, in the creation of the first national parks, right, which are in the American West, 3,000 miles away from here. So when the conservation, let's call them the early conservationists, are arguing for the creation of the Yosemite wilderness, right, or the conservation, the keeping, the cordoning off and keeping of the Yosemite wilderness in California, who do they call? They call Olmsted, right? They call the Central Park guy because he gets it, right? He gets that this wilderness isn't going to be just wilderness. It's going to be a park. Okay? All right. So we've got down here, I'm going to go back here for a second. And here is a quote from Olmsted about the national parks when he is arguing for them. Multiple times, he appeared many times in front of Congress, in front of the US Congress, saying, we must create this new system, this new idea, this new system, for the free use of the land by the whole body of the people forever. Okay? So what I'm trying to draw out is a kind of, a little bit, or more than a little bit, of a contradiction between the wild on one hand, right? And then this need for a park. And when we realize that national parks were modeled on city parks, not the gardens of the bourgeoisie, right? But city parks, which were also democratically available, right? Anyone can go. They were modeled on city parks. It was in the hope, with the desire, with the plan to make these wild spaces less wild, right? To make them a place where you can go and sort of have these pleasures without getting eaten, without dying of, anything. Right? So they're not so, you know, as much as, so it's this interesting, this is why I'm fascinated by this problem. We go there because we want this thing. We want the ancient, that thing, right? Sit down and shut up and listen and something ancient will return. Right? And at the same time, how we have made that possible for ourselves is by creating these park spaces. Right?
Safety.
Because it is safer, right? Well, and for lots of reasons, right? Because it's safer, the parks have infrastructure, or actually, I'll get back to this because I'm sure many of you are saying not all parks have infrastructure, and you're right. So there was a massive, the reason I'm giving you guys the history of this is because if you can see how the idea developed and how many different people were involved in the conversation around what a national park should be, right? And it seems so simple. The free use of the land by the whole body of the people forever. Super simple, done, right? And yet it was this very complex thing. How much infrastructure? How much safety? Who gets to go? How do they get there? What if it's really far away? Okay. All right, so let me just find myself in my notes here. So just to give you a sort of, okay, first of all, how are we doing? Hi guys. Hi. How are we doing back there? Can you guys see? Can you hear? Am I yelling? A little bit. Am I yelling? Yes, a little bit, I know. How about my people on the floor? You guys look great. What's, you guys okay down there? Okay. Questions so far?
It seems to me that
Alex, sir.
yes,
Yes.
that, in Russian conception of national park, is a little bit different, and it shifts to protection park
From development.
From humans.
From humans. So the humans stay out, development stays out.
I know I know one park, national park in Russia, where you can be eaten.
I'm sure there's more than one where you can be eaten. I will return to this, right? Because I realize the Russian situation is different, the Russian wilderness situation is different. And we will, but right now, right, all I'm talking about is how the national park idea was born in the United States at a particular moment, and then just like caught on like wildfire. I don't even know how many parks there are. I should know that. I'm supposed to be an expert. Don't tell anyone. Camera guys, we're going to edit that out. Okay? Cut. But we will return to this, right? Alaska is more of a correlate to the Russian situation, or at least to the Siberian situation, right? Yes, sir.
Have you ever been in national park in New York?
You mean in Central? In Central Park? Yeah. So Central Park is not a national park, but it is administered by the National Park Service. So it kind of is a national park, right? So is, by the way, the Statue of Liberty. These are all places that are administered by the same government agency, right? As Yellowstone, as Yosemite, and these sort of iconic nature parks. Have I ever been? Yes. Yes. The other question is, how many national parks have I visited? Or, you know, where have I been? It's my family, when we moved to the US in the 80s, okay, and I was a little kid, we did what everyone does. Every American, I thought it was every American family. I found out many years later, watching the Ken Burns documentary, that it's actually something that a lot of immigrant families do, right? So my parents knew that the one thing you go and check out in America is the West, right? You get in your car and you use that pretty extraordinary highway system, right, to drive west. And so that you can see the Grand Canyon, so you can see Death Valley, you can see the Rocky Mountains, and then later on, you're in California. So we did all of that. I was a little girl, and we took our cat. Don't ask me how this happened. We stuck the cat in the back seat, and we drove all over the country. We drove from New York State to California and back twice. Okay? So my parents infected me with this sickness that I have now, that I'm hoping to infect you with. In fact, when I look around, I'm like, how the hell did I get to Siberia? Then I think about those journeys, and I think that this is somehow an extension of that, right? Okay, are you with me? Yeah. We're going to go on. Excellent. Okay, so I promise you, I'm not going to give you a detailed history of the United States. I couldn't possibly, right? But just imagine that we are talking about, westward expansion, right? So on the East Coast, where's my map of the US? Hold on. On the East Coast, we've got the colonies here. Everything starts moving westward and complexifying, developing, industrializing very rapidly at the same time. Already, as this is happening, we've got philosophers here writing about the death of nature, right? This is in the 18th century still, as this is all happening. And they're saying, where are we going? What are we going to do? Man is losing his spirit. Man is losing his connection to God and his connection to the truth and his connection to himself. All he does is work in the factory, right? So as this is happening, we've got people going out this way and exploring, right? And hold on. And this is the part I forgot. We're building a railroad. This should sound familiar to the Russians, right? This is how you connect an empire, right? We are building a railroad. So it's not just sort of random exploration, right, of the newly annexed lands. It's also building the railroad to connect everything. As all of that's happening, suddenly people are saying maybe we should set some of this land aside and protect it. Okay? At the same time that we've got westward expansion and settlement and the building of the railroad, we've also got a civil war, right, in the 1860s. Ladies, hi. Nice to see you. We've also got a civil war going on, right? Right here. And we've also got, at the same time, something called the American Indian Wars, right? Now, what do we mean by the American Indian Wars? Wikipedia says the American Indian Wars start in 1622 and end in 1924. We are talking about 300 years of armed conflict, not wars like fun wars, right? But armed, actual wars, armed conflict between all of the Indian tribes here and what eventually becomes the United States government. So the American Indian Wars sort of reach their peak by the mid-19th century. This is when you've got already the Indians have been fighting the US Army, right? Before that, it was the colonial powers. They've already been fighting, but now they've got guns and they've got horses, right? And they're not going down easy, right? The reason that, well, I'm going to speak in broad strokes here, right? But one way to think about the reason that that what happened in the United States was a genocide was because the fight, they wouldn't stop fighting. They wouldn't be colonized, right? Which is a slightly different situation than was going on in Mexico, for example, at the same time. So as all of this is happening, people are also at the same time saying, hey, we need to protect nature. Right? And I think it's important to realize this, because when we think of the creation of the national parks, we just think of people sort of walking around the woods and having a nice time and saying, this is a beautiful waterfall, let's protect it, right? But what you're actually, the background, the historical background of this moment, the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s in America, is an extraordinarily unstable, right, time when something like a nation is trying to come into being, right? Or not come into being, depending on whose perspective you occupy. Okay? First national park is Yellowstone, 1872, right? It's the most famous national park in America. I think it's a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO site at this point, right? The next national park is Yosemite, which I will talk about in a moment. Yosemite is formed in, well, the next national park is actually a really tiny thing. Third national park is Yosemite, and then from 1890 to 1916 is how long it takes to create the National Park Service. So a good 25 years pass, during which these guys in California have to convince some guys in Washington, D.C. that this land, which has been so hard won, should just be put aside for enjoyment, right? So, it's the turn of the century. How are you going to convince, how are these guys going to convince these guys over here? Look at how far away they are. How are they going to convince them about the beauty of the land? What do you think? Taking them, well, they're busy. They're in Washington. They're making laws. It's hard. Photos, right? Because at the same time, you've got the birth of this new medium, which is also the ultimate democratic medium, photography. All of that exploration is accompanied by photographers. There are photographers on every single trip. They're taking photos all the time, right? And those guys here, at some point know that the only way to, because they can't take them there, because they're too busy and they're not going to go, right? And it would take like 4 weeks or something, I don't know, right? The only way is to show them pictures. So here you see a photo. Okay. Here are guys on a camping trip. This is a horse, right? And they're trying to show on this photo, they're trying to demonstrate the circumference of the General Sherman, which is this tree. It's a giant sequoia, right, in California, in what is now Sequoia National Park. The year is 1915. The General Sherman is, I read on Wikipedia, the oldest living organism. If someone would like to challenge that, feel free. But this is what I understand it to be, that it is in, I don't know how trees are categorized. There's some, I'm sure I'm missing some nuance, but it is among the oldest trees on Earth, living, not ever, but living, oldest living trees on Earth, quite possibly in some category the oldest living tree on Earth, and in fact the oldest living organism on Earth. It's something like, its maximum age is estimated at 2,700 years. Okay, so they are showing its circumference. This was a photograph taken by the editor of a very, very little known magazine at the time called National Geographic. He was on a camping trip in Sequoia, and he knew that he had to get these photographs to Congress. So when Congress finally sat down in 1916 to debate the creation of the national park system, every single person had, they came into work and they found, placed on their desk, a copy of National Geographic with these photographs right in it. Okay, and then and it's rumored, right, that because of this they signed the act into being, right? So we can add another layer here, right, of complexity, this layer of photography, right? How do we know, how do most of us know what most of the wilderness looks like? From the photographs. We haven't been there, right? We still haven't. We want to go, of course, but we haven't been there. Most of us are engaging with photographs all the time, right? And now we have all kinds of extraordinary pleasures like BBC Earth and these kinds of, you know, high definition, you know, I mean, my friends call it nature porn. Sorry, it's just my friends. I'm just reporting. Okay. Later on, the big photographer of the national parks becomes Ansel Adams, right? So I don't know if you guys know this name, Ansel Adams. Again, this is wonderful. Again, every single American would know this name. This is so at the center of the American imaginary of nature, are Ansel Adams's photographs of Yosemite. Right? These are ones that he takes. He becomes employed by the National Park Service in the 1940s, and he takes, I'm just going to show you guys a few really amazing, you know, photos. The point is, I mean, they're wonderful, but the point is not that we ooh and ah over the photos. It's that I want to show you sort of how the American national park imaginary gets shaped, right, over time. This is Half Dome, a famous photograph called Moonrise, right? Half Dome Moonrise, you see the moon. It's because of Ansel Adams's photographs that Yosemite becomes quite possibly the most famous national park in America for sure. I mean, Yellowstone, everyone knows you have to go to Yellowstone, but nobody really knows what it looks like. Like maybe it has like hot spring geysers, or maybe there's a, what do you do there? Nobody knows. Right? But Yosemite has a very iconic look. The Yosemite Valley has an iconic look. And that look is thanks to this photographer. Right? I will also mention that Yosemite is now the first national park in the United States to get a Starbucks. This is not real. Okay? But it could be in the future. So just wait. Just give us a few years, you know? We'll screw it up somehow, I'm sure. So this is a joke, of course, but this is that same Half Dome, right? So this is still Yosemite Valley. This is that same rock formation, and I found this picture. I thought it was funny. But the point is that, you know, that Yosemite has a Starbucks. There were massive protests against this, but Starbucks won. Go figure. Okay. Okay, good. So why am I talking about the history of the parks? I actually have to look at my notes to figure out why I'm talking about the history of the parks. It is not to torment you with history. It's because I'm fascinated by the fact that these are places that have such rich histories, right? And we've only talked for 20 minutes, right? These are places that have such rich histories, and yet when you visit them, the whole point of them is that there is no history. That nothing ever happened here except nature, right? So there are these places that are presented to us. The pleasure of them, the draw of them, is that they are completely ahistorical, right? And apolitical. Right? What could possibly be political about this? The delight of it is that it's a break from all of that weight, all of that geopolitical baggage, right? You can just go and be one with nature. And yet, I was delighted to find out, as early as 1901, a certain famous Austrian Viennese gentleman by the name of Sigmund Freud visits the United States. 1901. He's writing his book on fantasy, or he's writing up his notes, I don't know, on fantasy, right? And he says, you know what fantasy is? Fantasy is like the American national parks. Fantasy is this space that must remain completely closed off from reality so that reality can be bearable, so that we can do reality at all. We must have this sort of sacred, right, discrete, sacred, closed off space. And that's how, when he saw, this is 1901, when he's listening to these debates, listening to these conversations, this is what he sees, right? He doesn't see nature, he sees fantasy. And I will show you here a quote from one of my favorite theorists, one of my favorite contemporary theorists named Lauren Berlant. She has a book that she calls The National Symbolic. Or maybe that's a subtitle, I don't remember anymore. So let's read this together, okay? We inhabit the political space of the nation, which is not merely juridical, territorial, jus soli, so like the justice of the soil, right? Genetic, jus sanguinis, the justice of blood. Linguistic or experiential, but some tangled cluster of these. I call this space the national symbolic. Law dominates the field of citizenship, excuse me, constructing technical definitions of the citizen's rights, duties, and obligations. But the national symbolic also aims to link regulation to desire, harnessing affect to political life through the production of national fantasy, through the images, narratives, monuments, and sites that circulate through personal, collective consciousness. Thank you. Thank you so much. Excuse me, I need a hit of this. Okay, let's unpack this together because it's very dense sort of theoretical language, and I'm sorry for that. So we've got, right, so law dominates the field of citizenship. But the national symbolic, she says, is something else. It's something different than law. In other words, I am a citizen of a nation not just by law. There's something else going on, right? So she's interested in all those other things that form citizenship, right? She's especially interested in the feelings. The feelings. What does it mean to feel like a citizen of a nation? What does it mean to feel like I belong, like this land is my land? Right? Like, I am Russian. Yeah. And you know what? Look at that, you know, Lake Baikal. Look at that, Russia, right? Yes, I mean, this is how the stuff works. Right? In the US, it's the Grand Canyon. It's the iconic place. And you're like, oh, America. And also, if you're not from there, if you're not American, it feels like something also. Like, wow, that America is great. They must have, I don't know, it must be nice. Something like that, right? The national symbolic links regulation to desire. This is important, right? Because what does the law do? The law just comes in sort of from on high and tells you what to do and what not to do. But if you desire something, then then no one has to make you. Right? So the reason you don't go to your national parks and leave a bunch of garbage is not because it's against the law to litter. It's because you want, you guys are laughing. I know everybody's like, I do leave garbage. I know, but work with me here, okay? Try not to. But it's because you want, right? There's something here you want. This is giving you something that you want. It links regulation to desire, harnessing affect to political life. I want to talk about this word affect. Do you see it? It's not the same word as effect. Effect is written with an E. It's a different word, right? Affect, for the purposes of our class, affect just means feeling, okay? There are these people now, they're called affect theorists. They do affect theory, and they use this word affect. But it just means feeling, really, okay, for our purposes. Harnessing feeling to political life through the production of national fantasy, through the images, narratives, monuments, and sites that circulate through personal/collective consciousness. Right? So this is what when she talks about the national symbolic, it's precisely not the same thing as something like propaganda. Propaganda is this thing that you watch, you know it's a lie, right? And it's not, but it's something more like really good advertising that makes you hungry. You're like, damn, I want to eat that pizza. I know I shouldn't, right? It's something like that. But it's even more subtle than that. Because when you see advertising, you know it's advertising. That's how you can walk away from it. But when we see images of wilderness, we just go, did you guys get that on the mic? Okay. Here's a little treat for you. What is this? This is Mount Rushmore National Monument. Okay? You guys know who these guys are? I mean, obviously, what do they look like? Obviously, American presidents, right? So yes, Americans took a mountain and carved presidents' faces into the mountain. This happened. But this is something that every American child, you know, you go to school and you see something like this, right? I think it's very, it's singularly bizarre, precisely because we are not talking about a normal monument. Precisely because this is in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And I'll show you guys where that is in a moment. Because you have to travel really far to go see it. To go see this monument, which is George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. What's Roosevelt doing here? Not Franklin, Teddy Roosevelt, right? So he was president at the turn of or in the early 19th century, early 20th century, sorry. He signed many of the national parks into existence. So he's sort of the national park president, right? He's the guy who signed the paper. And he was considered a great conservationist at the time. Now,
Sorry, Margaret.
yes.
Could we by chance just turn this thing off? It's just cool.
It's cold, Katya. I'm told that it's cold. I have lost all feeling. So I only report. Sure. Yes.
Question. Like national symbolic, you were talking about nature. Yeah, we know it's out there, like Lake Baikal is out there. But still, I think the government should always, well, maybe not the government, but it should be emphasized all the time. Like, guys, it's there, and do you know why it is so important for us? Like this, I guess that's why I thought about this, because of this example. Just that you need maybe in a sophisticated way sometimes make focus all the time because, yeah, I know it's there, but I'm not thinking about this continuously. Even starting from
You're not-
school, it's, well,
Sure.
I'm thinking about this because
No, of
I
course.
want, but like,
Yeah.
in general, people would never really think about it as,
But I think that's also because we're talking about a different country,
yeah.
right? I mean, this is, you have to understand that the United States is a country that prides itself on its wilderness, right? One of the reasons for that, arguably, is because our cities are not so amazing. You know, Edward Abbey, who was the, he was superintendent of Arches National Park in Utah, and he's a great he's a great federal wilderness activist. I'll talk about the wilderness management program in a minute. He said the only thing worth keeping in the American West is the wilderness. He was basically saying, you know, destroy Los Angeles, please. You know, get rid of, Las Vegas. What are we talking about? This was his position, right? That all of the cities and settlements of the American West are garbage. And what there is wilderness that is uniquely beautiful and uniquely valuable, and that's all that America really has to offer. Right? So this is we are talking about a nation that imagines itself this way, that imagines that foregrounds and champions its wilderness very, very strongly. Okay? Regardless of where you're from, you could be from New York City, right? It's not the question, it's not about where you're from, it's the national symbolic, right? When you see pamphlets for tourists, or when you see like websites that say, top 10 things to see in America for tourists, right? In the top 3 will be a wilderness place, will be a national park. It will probably be the Grand Canyon. But it's not go see Chicago. It's not go see Miami, right? It's go see Yosemite or the Grand Canyon or Death Valley. Yes?
I wanted to say that personally I don't agree with that statement because in my experience there are a lot of projects for children and school kids that related to nature. Some like the weeks of nature when the kids like preschool, they draw a lot of pictures, and also we have a lot of projects like the 10 like natural what's like things you need to see in Russia.
Yes, attractions or
and
yes.
a lot of it. So I think that in Russia we have the same situation with America. So we talk a lot about nature and not about the Baikal, but the geysers, the ice caves, the islands, and etc.
Yeah, no, maybe so. Again, I will be very happy to hear you guys debate this and talk about this, you know, as we go along. But when it comes to the U.S., it is very much at the front of the citizenship feeling, right? Of the belonging feeling. Okay? And I think this is a symptom of that, right? That we are not just talking about a monument of presidents. Sure, every country has monuments of presidents, obviously, right? But not every country carves presidents' heads into mountains. Right? So it's and I just want to say, how are we doing on time? I've lost all sense of reality. It's 8? Perfect. We're doing amazing. Okay. I want to show you guys another picture. This one. Can you guys see in the back? Maybe someone in the front would like to interpret what's going on here. They're kind of disagreeing. What is this picture? Yeah, you've got a family here, right? A father and 2 daughters. They are Native Americans. They are Native Americans because remember we're talking about South Dakota, and I'll have something to say about that in a minute. They are Native Americans and they are giving the finger to Mount Rushmore, right? This picture went viral. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because often when we talk about national parks, the photos that come up, especially for foreigners, I mean, you see Mount Rushmore is not, look, this isn't a whole lot to look at, right? Compared to the stuff I showed you of Yosemite. I should have brought more pictures of national parks. I just thought it was too cheesy. I'm sorry. We'll see when we watch Grizzly Man, the movie, we'll see some more stuff, right? But usually when we are talking about national parks, everyone's talking about stuff over here, right? Or they're talking about Utah, which has a bunch of amazing parks in it, desert. But this region, the plains, the Great Plains, is very important when we talk about, excuse me, American Indian dispossession. That is the term, right? Or Native American dispossession. This word. This is the term used generally when to refer to the taking of land from the Native Americans, right? A lot of this went on with the creation of national parks. But it's a lot weirder and more complex than we usually think, than most of us know, right? So just as it was not true that as the frontier disappeared, right? Just as it's not true that these lands were unpeopled. You know what I mean by unpeopled? Empty, right? Just as it was not true that the lands were empty, it's also not true that American Indian dispossession looked the same across the board. Right? So every park has its own history, right, of dispossession. Some parks have not a very interesting history because there actually weren't any people living in them at the time of the formation of the park, especially ones in sort of harsh climates. But as I told you guys, remember the American Indian Wars that we talked about? So as the frontier, I want you guys to think about this because I think when we talk about the American frontier disappears. This is how the historians use the language. The frontier disappears in 1890. So it just keeps moving this way, this way, this way, this way, this way until it reaches the ocean, right? But what this means for the American Indian Wars is something very different. These lands were not heavily peopled by Indians. These lands were heavily peopled by Indians, okay? So here you have, precisely in South Dakota where Mount Rushmore is, right? You've got the Sioux Nation, you've got the Pawnees, which were always at war with the Sioux, you've got the Cheyenne in Wyoming, which is where Yellowstone National Park is. And then you've got all the Indians that were moved from here, from the Appalachian Mountains, via the Trail of Tears, which were several initiatives, not just one, via the Trail of Tears to Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. Right? So suddenly these people get relocated here. Again, this is all happening at that time, right? Mid-19th century to the end of the century. So the biggest armed conflict between the army and the last sort of great Indian nations is happening here, not here. So the parks that are here, right, have sort of very specific meaning for Americans as contested sites. Okay? Even though Indians were dispossessed everywhere of land, right? The parks that are here have a sort of special, they are politically hot in special ways, like Devil's Tower National Park, which you might remember from Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Anybody? Crickets? Anything? Nothing. Damn. Devil's Tower National Park, the Badlands, Mount Rushmore, like you saw, right? So that's why something like this is happening specifically here, and it's sort of appropriate. It's not just random Indians in a random national park saying, hey, you know, oh, I'm not allowed to swear. I'm sorry. You guys can imagine what I was about to say. Okay? Okay. And incidentally, right, when we talk about the Indian Wars continuing into the 1920s, we are talking about the Apache and Comanche nations, which were traveling down through here, which were nomadic, sort of horsebound peoples that were traveling down through here. So even when all of this, right, had surrendered to the US government, these guys didn't give a They were like, we are not going down, right? So they continued to fight, and they fought the US government and the Mexican government. So yeah, the last Apache wars are in 1923, 1924. Okay. Now, so this national fantasy is everywhere, right? But as I've tried to impress on you guys, I think in the United States, wilderness plays an especially meaty role in the formation of national fantasy. Okay? So that these, not only are the wild spaces imagined as democratic, whatever that means, because aren't they also supposed to be apolitical? But they're democratic, right? But also, democracy is imagined as natural, right? It's just the state of things. It's just what is, right? American democracy is just sort of the end of things. It's what we do, right? So you can see how national fantasies as nature, when national fantasy and natural fantasy become one thing, it's very, very powerful stuff. The national parks became enormously popular, so that by the 1960s, they were already famously overrun with people, litter, children, just noise, traffic, pollution, every terrible thing, right? And at this point, it's in the 1960s that the American government decides they need a different approach to the question of nature, because it's not working. Because instead of a wilderness, instead of a protected wilderness, what we've created is a park, and everybody showed up. So you've got, interestingly, in 1963, the year, this is at the height of the civil rights movement in America, right? You've got the March on Washington, Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, right? Where he says, America, you promised people something and you didn't deliver, right? At exactly that moment, right, exactly, maybe a few months later, right, Congress is, because they've got their hands full, Congress is deciding on something called the Wilderness Act. The Wilderness Act of 1964 establishes the National Wilderness Preservation System, which is a separate system from the National Park Service. The idea of wilderness is a little bit different than the idea of the national park. Let's look. Wilderness protects open space, watersheds, natural soundscapes, diverse ecosystems, and biodiversity. The literature of wilderness experience frequently cites the inspirational and spiritual values of wilderness, including opportunities to reflect on the community of life and the human place on earth. Wilderness provides a sense of wildness, which can be valuable to people, notice, whether or not those individuals actually visit. Just knowing that wilderness exists can produce a sense of curiosity, inspiration, renewal, and hope. There's another place I forgot to look it up. There's the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act is a place where man visits but does not stay. Right? So this language is very different. It's not, this is for you. It's, this is not really for you. Like, this is for this stuff, right? Protects open space, watersheds, soundscapes, ecosystems, biodiversity. That's what it's for. You can come visit. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Right? So the Wilderness Act is a little bit different. I like this idea. I'm fascinated by this notion that wilderness, just knowing that wilderness exists, you don't have to visit, just knowing that it exists, right, can produce a sense of curiosity, inspiration, renewal, and hope. And here is a quote by Wallace Stegner, who was a writer, who was a sort of nature writer at the time, and he was commissioned to argue for the Wilderness Act and to write a document in favor of it. This is a famous quote by him. "We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in. For it can be a means of assuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope." Okay. You guys see that? Everybody see that? A means of assuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures. So what am I hearing that he's not saying? Normal life is, it's insane. It drives us insane. We got to drive to the edge of the wilderness and look in, just to remember that it's okay, that things are okay, right? And this is only 1964. Okay. Yes.
Do these areas have another level of protection?
Okay, so yes, good, thank you. I completely forgot to talk about this. Thank you. So the question is, what is wilderness and what does that mean in practice, right? Yes, so the wilderness preservation system and the national park system are different. They are often geographically, superimposed or overlapping, thank you, but not exactly. They are not exactly overlapping. And yeah, wilderness has different laws apply. Right? And what wilderness means in different parks, so we talk about things like in upstate New York where I live, it's called the Big Indian Wilderness. And that's not a national park, but it's a wilderness, which means you can't do certain things, which means you can only camp at a certain distance from a road. And you have to be invisible, I think, from the road or something. There are all these laws sort of governing wilderness. Okay? How are we doing?
Right?
Great. You guys look great.
Thank you.